It is. Can you hear me now? Good. What commercial is that from? All right. So to back up, we're going to be going over week 1 of the quiet gift. This will be going through Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. And this is the kind of generosity only the Father sees. So let me ask you, have you ever done the right thing for the wrong reasons? Maybe you're the Tom Pettiest of the pettiest people. You show up early, you give a generous gift, you pray with passion, you serve with joy, but somewhere deep down, you hope somebody would have noticed. You hope they say, wow, look at them. They're really going above and beyond. And that's the trap that Jesus warns us about in Matthew 6. So today we begin a new series called The Quiet Gift, where we'll walk through Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 through 4, and Jesus' teaching on charitable giving. But this is more than a message about money. It's a message about motive, about audience, and the kind of righteousness that God rewards. Jesus begins this portion of the Sermon on the Mount by warning us. Be careful. Watch out. Because if we're not paying attention, we can fall into the applause trap, doing holy things for human approval. So let's dive into the text and hear what Jesus has to say. So in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "Be careful that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Some of us might be wondering what this is about. This is about giving, but it's also about your heart. And Jesus is calling us to something deeper, to a life not driven by recognition, but rooted in relationship. So let's break down his word together. Point 1, a caution against spiritual showmanship. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus said something that would have shocked his audience. It says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will in no way enter the kingdom of heaven." Now that statement sets the tone for what follows in Matthew 6. So the scribes and the Pharisees, we hear them all the time. They were the spiritual elite. They were the standard, the ones that everybody was supposed to look up to and get to that level. But Jesus is saying, if your faith is only skin deep, if your righteousness is only external, you've missed the kingdom altogether. True righteousness flows from the heart. Now, in Matthew 6, Jesus shows us what kind of greater righteousness and what it looks like. Not loud, performative religion, but quiet, sincere devotion. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "Be careful that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." So, Jesus begins with a strong warning. Again, be careful. In the Greek, this is proshete. Pay close attention. Buyer beware. To be constantly on guard. Some of us think this might be a one-time check of yourself, but this is a constant, ongoing thing. It's a continual watchfulness over our motives. The same word, proshete, shows up often in Jesus' teachings. Like in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. It says, "Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." We see it again in Luke chapter 12, verse 1. "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." And again in Mark chapter 8, verse 15. "Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Again and again, Jesus calls us to examine what's beneath the surface of words, actions, and even our faith. But we have to ask ourselves, why? Why are we being called to examine this? It's because spiritual danger often looks religious on the outside. And Jesus is saying, you can be doing good, godly things and still be missing the point. Amen. You can give, you can serve, you can even sacrifice, and end up without the eternal reward. A quote from John Scott says, "The greatest threat to righteousness is not rebellion, but pride." And brings us to our next point, a deceptive desire. So let's look more closely at Jesus' words. "Do not do your charitable deeds before men." Now, the phrase charitable deeds refers to the act of mercy, compassion, and generosity. What we might call acts of kindness or benevolence. In Jewish tradition, we often call this almsgiving, one of the three central pillars of devotion alongside prayer and fasting. Jesus is not condemning generosity. He's addressing our motives. When he says before men, he's confronting the temptation to make our generosity a public display. This includes things like being recognized by a group, praised by a leader, or ensuring our service is seen by others. It's not about whether others see, it's about whether we want them to see. In the Army, in the military in general, you'll often find yourself getting news that some commanding general who's high up that you've never heard of is going to come and make his way through your barracks, your office area, or just in general on base. So, while many times things are disheveled in the military, I'm not going to say a smooth-oiled machine, but a machine of sorts. But as soon as that information gets pushed down that somebody might be coming by, everybody has to look busy all the time. You have to be putting on this show that you're doing the right thing all the time. And what's always fun is they never come by. They're like, "Oh, we were just in the state," not actually at your base. So, we crave that affirmation as people, that applause, that recognition, no matter how big or how small. It's part of our fallen nature. We want people to see how spiritual we are, how generous we are, and how godly we are. And often, we start doing good things with pure motives. But slowly, subtly, we notice, or we start noticing who's noticing. Jesus is speaking to this tendency, not in pagans, but in religious people, people like you and me. When we look at Proverbs chapter 16, verse 2, it says, "All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the motives." And it brings us to our next point, of performing to be seen. So Jesus continues, "to be seen by them." This phrase gets to the heart of the issue, motive. It's not what you do, it's why you do it. When your acts of generosity are done with desires to be noticed, you've shifted from service to performance. And we all know that feeling. Posting on social media about a kind act, not to inspire, but to impress. Giving publicly or even anonymously and secretly hoping somebody finds out. Serving faithfully, but growing resentful when no one acknowledges our efforts. These are all signs that we've started to perform for the crowd, not for Jesus. And Jesus is clear. If being seen is your goal, then being seen will be your reward. That applause, that praise you get, that's all you'll get. And we see that in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, when it says, "Otherwise you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Now, that's a sobering reality for a lot of us. Heaven doesn't reward spiritual performances. God doesn't bless religious theater. He blesses sincerity, that quiet faithfulness, the unseen act of obedience that spring from a heart that longs for him, not for attention. So again, that's a sobering statement. Jesus is saying, if your motive is to be seen and you get seen, that's it. No more reward. Because heaven does not clap for earthly performances. And before we move into verse 2, notice the shift that Jesus makes. In verse 1, he gives a caution, a warning about the dangers of doing righteous things with the wrong heart. Now in verse 2, he moves from warning to example. He's taking that theological concern of spiritual pride and grounding it in a concrete situation. Giving. One addresses the danger of performance. The other illustrates what performance looks like. Jesus moves from the principle to the picture, from motive to method, from thought to action. It's a call to quiet generosity. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 2, it says, "Therefore, when you do your charitable deeds, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in synagogues and in the streets, that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward." So Jesus isn't condemning giving. He's assuming it. It's not an if, it's a when you give. But he is condemning the showmanship. He's confronting a culture where giving becomes a platform for public praise. As we learned in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus already warned us that righteousness isn't about the show, the spectacle. It's about the substance. In fact, he told us not to let our light shine before men to receive praise, but so they may glorify our Father in heaven. And that's found in Matthew 5:16. But now that we're in chapter 6, Jesus makes a critical clarification. Some aspects of our faith are meant to be quietly cultivated, not displayed. And here, the issue is not visibility, but again, it's motive. Who gets the glory? Is it for us, or is it for God? So the trumpet illustration. There's no historical evidence of an actual trumpet being blown, but Jesus is using vivid imagery. He's painting a picture of people making a scene as they drop their coins in the offering plate, wanting to be noticed, to be admired. That kind of illusion connects back to the Old Testament, where God consistently emphasized that the heart behind the offering matters more than the size of it. And we see this in a few places. In Amos chapter 5, verse 21 through 24, God rebukes Israel's outward display of religion, saying, I despise your feast days, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Or in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, Samuel tells Saul, to obey is better than a sacrifice. And again in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 3, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than a sacrifice. The idea of sounding a trumpet draws on the tendency of religious leaders to seek their praise for their religious devotion. While literal trumpets may not have been used for giving, there were trumpets sounding during feasts, festivals, and public gatherings. So the image would have resonated with Jesus' audience. Kind of like when your parents paint a picture, like if you do this, you're going to get in this much trouble. You know, you got to paint a good picture that everybody's going to understand. I'm sure we can all resonate with that, right? So, the word that Jesus uses is hypocrites. And that is derived from the Greek word hypocrites, which refer to the stage actors wearing a mask. Pretenders, performers. He's calling out spiritual theater. And a great quote by Oswald Chambers says, the great enemy of life, of faith, is the love of publicity. And the venues that Jesus mentions, in the synagogues and in the streets, remind us that public spaces can become performance stages. Even acts of mercy became spotlights for self. In modern terms, it's that carefully curated social media post about giving, the name plaque on the donation wall, or the subtle, humble brag about generosity. It's easy to let our giving become our platform instead of our praise. And that brings us to the contrast of character. In contrast to the public spectacle of the hypocrites, Jesus is calling his followers to a quiet, sincere, and God-focused generosity. He's drawing a line between superficial righteousness and the deeper righteousness he laid out in chapter 5. Remember how he said, do not practice your righteousness before others to be seen by them. And earlier he said, let your light so shine before men. The difference is motive. One seeks the applause of man, the other seeks the glory of God. In Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 10, it says, I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruits of his deeds. The religious leaders of this time were admired for their outward piety, but Jesus saw their hearts, and now he's teaching us to give in a way that's not about us, but about trust, worship, and obedience to a God who sees us in secret. Because heaven isn't impressed by our stage presence, but the Father is deeply moved by the hidden gift, the kind of generosity that only he sees. So we need to walk away from the applause, because we live in a world that thrives on likes, follows, and public affirmation. We need to remind ourselves that Jesus is inviting us to something different, something better. He's inviting us to live a life that is quiet, generous, and sincere. A life that only heaven sees. A life that doesn't settle for the temporary applause of man, but lives for eternal reward of the Father. So today, I want you to ask yourself, who am I giving for? What am I hoping to gain? Whose approval matters most? Do I have the integrity, the intestinal fortitude, the grit to do what is right in the eyes of God, even if no one is watching? We need to walk away from the applause, embrace the quiet gift, and give in such a way that only your Father sees, and trust that his reward is always better. For the applause of man fades, but the approval of the Father lasts forever. Wow, kind of blew through that one. That was a super fast sermon. So, I guess when Aaron's not here, we're having short sermons. So, before we wrap this up, we're going to continue this in next week, going through Matthew chapter 6, verse 3 and 4, with the message titled Behind the Curtain, focusing on the secret nature of true generosity and what it means in a way that not even your left hand knows what your right hand is doing. So today, if you want to look inwards, I want you to ask yourself those questions. Who are you giving for? What are you hoping to gain? And are you caring more about what man thinks of you or what God thinks of you? I want you guys all to take a hard look and live for God, not for man. Man's approval means nothing. Man's approval ebbs and flows with the changing winds. We see it on a daily basis. But God is steadfast, God is never changing, and God is always there. What man wants and what man approves of isn't always what God approves of. And we need to be seeking him out in all that we do. So with that being said, let's take a moment. Let's pray over our lives, over the people in our lives. Let's ask God to search ourselves and to build us up in his image so we can follow him being the light and being the light here on earth for all to see and follow.